There is a forbidden inner posture the rich never abandon. Feel it once, before you react, before you complain, and the shadow world rearranges itself to keep you on top. Neville Goddard shattered this surface-level belief with a principle that is deeply unsettling to the conditioned mind. Assumption does not reflect reality. It selects and distorts it. This is not poetic language or spiritual exaggeration. It is a functional description of how experience is generated. Consciousness does not wait for reality to form and then respond. It moves first, silently choosing what will be emphasized, what will be ignored, and what will be permitted to feel inevitable. What you call facts are not neutral data points, but confirmations filtered through an already established inner position. The assumption you occupy determines which aspects of the infinite field of possibility are allowed to crystallize into experience. Neville described the world as a shadow cast by consciousness, not as an independent structure with its own authority. A shadow has no power of its own. It moves only because something else moves first. Yet most people spend their lives arguing with shadows, trying to change circumstances, people, systems, and outcomes, without ever questioning the light that produces them. This is why effort so often feels exhausting and ineffective. You are attempting to rearrange effects while leaving the cause untouched. Consciousness remains fixed, and so the shadow obediently repeats itself in new forms. When people speak about the rich, they usually mean those who possess money, assets, or visible influence. But this is a superficial interpretation that misses the actual mechanism of power. Wealth is not the source of authority. It is the byproduct of a dominant perceptual state. The rich, in the truest sense, are those who assume inevitability in their favor. They do not experience life as something that must be negotiated, justified, or emotionally wrestled into submission. They occupy a position in which outcomes feel normal before they arrive. This internal normalcy quietly reorganizes the external world around them. Modern science has begun to brush against this truth in its own language. Research in biology and behavior increasingly demonstrates that perception governs response, and response shapes outcomes. The body, the nervous system, and decision-making processes do not react to reality as it is, but to reality as it is perceived. Two individuals exposed to the same environment can exhibit entirely different physiological reactions, levels of stress, and behavioral patterns, simply because their underlying assumptions differ. What looks like luck, resilience, or intelligence on the surface is often the expression of a deeper perceptual filter operating beneath awareness. This brings us to the premise that most people resist because it threatens the comfort of external explanations. Power is rarely maintained by force alone. It is maintained by a hidden assumption about what is normal and inevitable. When a certain outcome feels just the way life works, it no longer needs to be enforced. It perpetuates itself automatically through expectation, behavior, and selective perception. Entire hierarchies, financial, social, relational, are stabilized not because they are objectively true, but because they are assumed to be. The danger of this mechanism is not that it exists, but that it operates invisibly. Most individuals never consciously choose their assumptions. They inherit them. They absorb them through repetition, observation, and emotional imprinting until those assumptions feel indistinguishable from reality itself. At that point, questioning them feels unnatural, even threatening. And yet, every shift of power begins precisely there, not with rebellion against circumstances, but with a quiet refusal to accept the perceptual position you were handed. What follows in this discussion is not a motivational argument, nor a moral critique of wealth or status. It is an examination of how reality bends around assumption, how perception quietly governs authority, and why those who understand this principle do not struggle against appearances. They move beneath them. To grasp this is to realize that the world you experience is not revealing truth to you. It is revealing you to yourself. If this is unsettling your view of reality, stay here, subscribe, and hold the assumption with us. At some point, the idea that reality is neutral begins to fracture under its own weight. If the world truly operated as a fair and impartial system, outcomes would distribute themselves evenly. Effort would reliably translate into reward, and perception would have little influence over results. Yet lived experience repeatedly contradicts this. People with similar intelligence, work ethic, and opportunity diverge dramatically in outcomes, not once, but consistently. This inconsistency is not a flaw in the system. It is evidence of a deeper organizing principle at work. Reality is not a static field responding equally to all observers. It is a responsive structure that reorganizes itself around the assumptions that dominate consciousness. Consider two individuals standing beneath the same storm. The rain is identical, the wind no different, the external conditions perfectly shared. Yet one experiences threat, loss, and instability, while the other perceives timing, advantage, or even relief. The storm itself has no meaning. Meaning is assigned before interpretation becomes conscious. One person's nervous system tightens, scanning for danger, while the other remains open, already oriented toward benefit. The difference is not attitude in the superficial sense, but assumption. Reality does not announce what it is. It waits to be told what it means. This is where the idea of fairness quietly dissolves. Fairness assumes a neutral referee, a world that distributes outcomes independently of perception. But a responsive reality does not operate this way. It mirrors dominance, not morality. The assumptions that are most stable, most unquestioned, and most emotionally uncharged exert the greatest organizing power. Reality arranges itself around what is expected, not what is deserved. This is uncomfortable to accept because it removes the comfort of external blame and replaces it with internal responsibility at a level most people have never examined. Once this is seen, the lever becomes obvious. If reality bends, then assumption must be the force applying pressure. Circumstances do not argue with expectation, they yield to it. The world does not need to be convinced or corrected. It needs to be reinterpreted at the level where interpretation precedes experience. Those who appear favored by life are rarely fighting harder or believing louder. They are simply standing in a position where certain outcomes feel inevitable, and inevitability exerts a quiet but relentless pull on events. This is the true disruption. Not that the world is unfair in a moral sense, but that it is obedient in a structural one. It responds to dominance of assumption the way a shadow responds to light. When this is understood, the search for external validation, permission, or rescue begins to lose its grip. Reality stops being an enemy or a judge and reveals itself as a mirror, precise, impersonal, and exact. The question then is no longer why the world behaves as it does, but which assumption you are standing in when it responds. There is a moment of reversal that quietly alters how reality is understood, and it begins when you realize that perception does not follow evidence, it precedes it. Most people believe they observe first and conclude second, that facts arrive fully formed, and the mind merely reacts. In truth, consciousness selects long before logic ever enters the scene. What you notice, what stands out, what feels relevant or irrelevant, is already filtered through an assumption that has been operating in the background, often for years. By the time you believe you are reasoning, the conclusion has already been chosen. Imagine wearing tinted glasses for so long that you forget you are wearing them. The world appears a certain color, and over time that color feels natural, unquestionable, even factual. You stop asking whether the tint exists at all. In the same way, assumption quietly colors perception until the filtered version of reality feels like reality itself. Opportunities that do not match the assumption go unseen. Signals that contradict it are dismissed or reinterpreted. Evidence is not evaluated impartially. It is curated. This is why arguments with appearances are so ineffective. Appearances are not causes, they are outputs. To argue with them is to argue with the end of a process that has already completed itself internally. Those who control outcomes understand this intuitively. They do not waste energy emotionally reacting to what is currently visible. They recognize appearances as temporary confirmations of a prior state, not as final verdicts. Their attention remains anchored at the level where selection happens, not where results merely display themselves. The great reversal occurs when you grasp that the world is not showing you what is possible, but what is permitted by your current position in consciousness. Two people can stand before the same set of facts and walk away with entirely different conclusions, not because one is smarter, but because one is seeing through a different lens. Logic does not override this process, it serves it. Reason arranges itself around what perception has already allowed to be real. Once this is understood, the struggle to change your mind through force or repetition begins to lose relevance. The issue is not convincing yourself of something new, but recognizing the filter that has been quietly deciding for you all along. When the filter changes, the field of evidence reorganizes effortlessly. Reality begins to present confirmations that feel surprising, only because the previous assumption had trained you not to see them. What looks like sudden insight or luck is often nothing more than a shift in what consciousness allows itself to register. This is why those who appear unbothered by contradiction often hold the greatest power. They are not ignoring reality, they are operating beneath it. They understand that what is seen today is the residue of yesterday's assumption, and that tomorrow's world is already being assembled by the lens through which they are perceiving now. In this reversal, perception is no longer a passive window, but an active gatekeeper, silently deciding which version of reality is allowed to come into view. The most powerful assumptions are rarely dramatic or emotional. They do not announce themselves as beliefs, nor do they feel chosen. They operate quietly under the guise of normalcy, disguised as common sense, realism, or maturity. "This is how life works" is one of the most dangerous sentences a mind can accept, because it closes the door on alternative structures of reality without ever appearing to do so. Once an assumption is normalized, it no longer feels like an assumption at all. It feels like the floor beneath your feet. Normalization is not merely acceptance, it is invisibility. When something is normalized, it stops being examined. It becomes the reference point against which all other possibilities are measured and often dismissed. This is how entire lives are shaped without deliberate choice. Limits are not encountered as resistance but as facts. Delays are not questioned as distortions but accepted as the natural pace of things. Hierarchies persist, not because they are enforced at every moment, but because they are assumed to be structurally necessary. Imagine living in a small room your entire life, believing the walls are load-bearing. You arrange your furniture carefully, move cautiously, and never consider expanding beyond those boundaries because collapse seems inevitable. The walls are not tested, not because they are strong, but because the assumption of their necessity goes unquestioned. In the same way, most people organize their ambitions, relationships, and sense of self around limits that have never been examined. The room feels safe precisely because it is familiar, even if it is confining. This hidden assumption governs what feels realistic. It defines the upper and lower bounds of expectation without ever being named. When something good happens, it is framed as rare or temporary. When something undesired occurs, it is rationalized as normal. Over time, this pattern reinforces itself, creating a self-sealing logic that appears to be confirmed by experience, when in fact it is generating that experience. The mind confuses repetition with truth. The moment normal is questioned, something subtle but irreversible begins to happen. Hierarchy loses its solidity. Outcomes that once felt reserved for others begin to feel structurally possible, not because effort increases, but because permission has quietly shifted. The assumption that maintained separation dissolves, and with it, the invisible scaffolding that upheld limitation. What replaces it is not chaos, but flexibility, a sense that reality may not be as rigid as it once appeared. This is where power quietly changes hands, not through confrontation, but through reinterpretation. When the hidden assumption is exposed, it loses its authority. The world does not collapse when "this is how life works" is challenged. It rearranges. And in that rearrangement, the individual who no longer accepts inherited normalcy begins to occupy a different position altogether, one in which possibility is no longer exceptional, but expected. Power, in its most effective form, is remarkably quiet. It does not announce itself through intensity, urgency, or emotional pressure. In fact, the moment strong emotion is required to sustain an expectation, authority has already been compromised. True power operates from a state of calm expectancy, where outcomes are anticipated without inner negotiation. There is no need to persuade the world, the self, or anyone else. The assumption simply rests in place, stable and unchallenged, and reality organizes itself accordingly. This is why emotional intensity is so often mistaken for belief. Excitement, desperation, and effort can feel convincing because they are loud, but they are also unstable. They imply uncertainty. Calm expectancy, by contrast, carries no urgency because it does not question its own legitimacy. It resembles the internal posture of someone who already knows how a situation will resolve, not because of optimism, but because of position. Expectation without emotional charge is not hope, it is orientation. Consider the image of a banker approving a loan. There is no dramatic build-up, no emotional investment in the outcome, no need to justify the decision repeatedly. Authority is expressed through ease. The decision moves forward because it aligns with an established framework, not because it is argued into existence. In the same way, the power state does not strain toward outcomes. It assumes them as part of an internal order that feels ordinary and unquestioned. What makes this state elusive for many is the belief that it must be cultivated through effort, repetition, or struggle. In reality, it is installed through identification. The power state is not something you practice from the outside. It is something you occupy from the inside. Once the identity associated with inevitability is assumed, behavior, emotion, and perception fall into alignment automatically. The absence of emotional charge is not indifference, but confidence so complete that reaction becomes unnecessary. This explains why those who hold authority often appear detached or unbothered by delays and contradictions. Their calm is not passivity, it is structural. They are not waiting for proof in order to expect. Expectation is already in place, and proof arrives as a formality. When emotion arises, it does not drive the assumption, it follows it. The center of gravity remains stable, and because of that stability, the external world adjusts with minimal resistance. To understand this state is to recognize that power is not about wanting more strongly, but about assuming more quietly. The louder the inner argument, the weaker the position. The quieter the assumption, the more inevitable the outcome feels. In this silence, expectation becomes authority, and authority becomes the unseen force shaping events without effort or display. There is a particular threshold of consciousness where perception becomes malleable without resistance, and Neville referred to this threshold as the state akin to sleep. It is not sleep itself, but a softened border where the analytical mind loosens its grip and the deeper perceptual mechanisms come forward. In this state, the mind is no longer busy defending what it already believes to be real. It becomes receptive, not to fantasy but to reinterpretation. This is where assumption can be rewritten at the level that actually governs experience. Most attempts at change fail because they focus on the scene rather than the lens. People try to repaint circumstances, replace external details, or force new outcomes while continuing to view the world through the same perceptual filter. The result is frustration because the projector remains unchanged. SATS works precisely because it does not argue with the visible world. It bypasses it. By entering a state where sensory input is dimmed and inner imagery carries more weight, the lens itself is adjusted, and the projected image reorganizes on its own. The projector analogy reveals why effort is unnecessary in this process. When the focus of a projector is altered, the screen does not need to be touched. It responds automatically. In the same way, when perception is rewritten in SATS, the senses may initially resist because they are accustomed to confirming the old assumption. This resistance is not failure, it is inertia. The external world is still echoing a previous state, even as a new one is being installed beneath awareness. This explains why changes initiated in this inner state often feel subtle at first. There is rarely an immediate dramatic shift in appearance. Instead, there is a quiet realignment in how situations are interpreted, how opportunities are noticed, and how responses emerge without conscious planning. The world begins to look different not because it has changed yet, but because the lens through which it is viewed has already shifted. Perception moves first, and the senses follow reluctantly, then obediently. What makes SATS uniquely powerful is its lack of conflict. There is no need to convince, affirm, or emotionally charge the assumption. In this softened state, the mind accepts impressions without debate. Identity becomes fluid and new positions can be occupied without resistance. The assumption feels natural because it is introduced before the old one has time to object. When consciousness returns to waking awareness, the new lens is already in place, quietly influencing what feels normal and inevitable. This is why Neville emphasized altering perception rather than circumstances. Circumstances are transient reflections. Perception is the organizing principle. Once the lens is changed, the scene cannot help but follow, even if it lags behind for a time. The senses may protest, logic may question, but reality, being obedient rather than authoritative, adjusts itself to match the dominant assumption now operating beneath the surface. The moment emotional reactivity takes control, power quietly drains away. This is not because emotion is inherently harmful, but because reaction signals subordination to appearances. When the external world dictates the internal state, authority has already shifted outward. The assumption that once organized experience becomes destabilized, replaced by a reflexive posture that seeks reassurance, explanation, or defense. In that instant, the old perceptual hierarchy reasserts itself. Emotional reaction feels justified because it appears responsive and human, yet it is often the clearest indicator that an assumption is no longer dominant. Reactivity reveals attachment to outcomes and dependence on validation from circumstances. It turns attention outward, away from the internal position that actually governs events. The more intense the reaction, the more power is being conceded to what is already a shadow of a previous state. Consider a chess player who panics mid-game. The board has not changed, but the player's internal orientation has. Strategy dissolves into impulse, and in that loss of composure, information is revealed to the opponent. Emotional reaction functions in the same way. It exposes uncertainty, disrupts stability, and invites the return of old assumptions that thrive on doubt and urgency. What was once quiet authority becomes noise. Power, by contrast, is remarkably undramatic. It does not need to announce itself through visible confidence or emotional suppression. It simply remains unperturbed. This quiet is not indifference, but dominance. When an assumption is secure, external contradictions do not provoke reaction because they are not interpreted as threats. They are recognized as transitional echoes, already losing relevance as a new state consolidates itself. This is why emotional restraint often accompanies genuine authority, not because feelings are denied, but because they are no longer steering perception. The internal position remains intact, regardless of external fluctuation. When reaction subsides, assumption regains its organizing role. The world once again responds to expectation rather than emotion, and outcomes realign accordingly. Understanding this adversary is crucial, because emotional reactivity does not announce itself as weakness. It masquerades as realism, concern, or engagement. Yet each reactive moment subtly reinforces the very assumptions one is attempting to transcend. Power is not dramatic because it does not need to convince. It remains steady, and in that steadiness, reality adjusts itself without spectacle. When an assumption reaches a certain level of stability, reality begins to reorganize itself in a way that feels almost invisible. There is rarely a single dramatic moment where everything suddenly changes. Instead, a sequence of events unfolds, with a quiet precision that is easy to overlook if one is still expecting spectacle. Neville referred to this unfolding as the bridge of incidents, not to suggest something mystical or theatrical, but to describe the structural way in which assumption expresses itself through time. Once the inner position is set, movement begins automatically, and the external world starts arranging itself to match what has already been accepted internally. What makes this process difficult to recognize is its ordinariness. The incidents themselves often appear neutral, even insignificant. A conversation that seems casual, a delay that feels inconvenient, a decision that appears spontaneous. Yet each of these moments is part of a larger alignment responding to the dominant assumption. Because perception has already shifted, these events are interpreted differently. They are no longer seen as obstacles or random occurrences, but as natural progressions. The assumption does not demand a straight line. It generates coherence. This coherence is what gives the bridge its power. Each incident subtly reinforces the perceptual position that produced it. When something aligns even slightly, the mind registers confirmation. That confirmation strengthens expectation, and strengthened expectation invites further alignment. The process feeds itself without effort. Over time, the distinction between cause and effect becomes blurred because the assumption and the events it generates appear to arise together. Reality begins to feel cooperative, not because it has changed its nature, but because it is now responding to a position that is internally consistent. The analogy of a rumor becoming true captures this dynamic precisely. A rumor gains traction not because it is initially accurate, but because people begin to behave as though it is. Their behavior creates circumstances that make the rumor appear validated. In the same way, an assumption does not wait for proof in order to exert influence. It moves first, shaping perception, behavior, and interpretation. The resulting events seem to confirm the assumption, when in fact they are its echo. What looks like evidence is often the residue of expectation. As the bridge of incidents unfolds, something subtle but important occurs. Emotional intensity diminishes. Early in the process, there may be anticipation or curiosity, but as alignment continues, these feelings settle into normalcy. The assumption no longer feels new or fragile. It begins to feel established. This is why the final stages of manifestation are often quiet. There is no rush of excitement, no sense of arrival. Outcomes feel appropriate rather than extraordinary. They register as, of course, rather than finally. This loss of excitement is not a failure of imagination. It is a sign of perceptual dominance. When an assumption is fully integrated, it no longer triggers emotional spikes because it is no longer being tested. It has become part of the internal order. Reality responds accordingly, stabilizing around this new position. The world stops challenging the assumption because it no longer detects inconsistency. At this point, the bridge completes itself without supervision. Attempting to watch, measure, or control the sequence only reintroduces the very doubt that weakens it. The power of the bridge lies in its inevitability. Once the assumption is stable, reality has no alternative but to conform. The incidents continue until the external world fully mirrors the internal position, not as a dramatic reward, but as a natural conclusion to a process that was decided long before the final outcome appeared. Wealth is often treated as the ultimate marker of power, yet it is only one visible expression of a deeper structure. Beneath money, status, and influence lies the state one occupies in consciousness. Hierarchy does not originate primarily in systems or privilege. It emerges from assumption and then expresses itself outwardly. This is why patterns tend to repeat across different areas of life. Financial position, social standing, and relational dynamics often mirror one another not by coincidence, but because they are generated from the same internal altitude. Assumption functions like elevation. From a lower vantage point, the world appears crowded with obstacles, and hierarchy feels rigid and external. From a higher position, the same environment reveals pathways, leverage, and flexibility. Nothing in the terrain changes, yet navigation becomes effortless. In the same way, a shift in assumption does not alter isolated outcomes. It reorganizes the entire field of experience. This is why wealth gained without a corresponding change in state often feels unstable or temporary. Reality resists incoherence. It settles where expectation is calm, consistent, and unquestioned. Beyond money, this explains why some individuals naturally command attention or authority without visible effort. Their internal position is coherent, and the world arranges itself to reflect it. Hierarchy, then, is not something to fight or fear. It is informational. It reveals where consciousness is positioned, and when that position shifts, hierarchy quietly rearranges itself in response. Neville's central truth comes into sharp focus here. The world does not resist power. It obeys assumption. What appears as resistance is usually delayed alignment, the afterimage of a previous perceptual state still unfolding. Reality is not oppositional or selective. It reorganizes itself around the assumption that has become stable within consciousness. The hidden assumption is not secret knowledge or specialized technique. It is unquestioned identity. It is what feels normal, inevitable, and self-evident about who you are and what life allows you to experience. Because it operates without scrutiny, it governs outcomes with remarkable efficiency. Neville's mirror analogy explains this with precision. A mirror does not correct or improve what it reflects. It simply responds to the source placed before it. In the same way, perception shifts first, and external conditions follow automatically. Trying to change the reflection while leaving perception intact only reinforces the illusion that circumstances have authority. This principle aligns with the work of Dr. Bruce Lipton, who showed that perception governs biological response, behavior, and long-term results. The mind and body respond not to objective reality, but to interpretation. SATS functions as the gateway where assumption can be installed without resistance. When authority is assumed quietly and without justification, the world has no option but to rearrange itself in response.